expected a few more people.
Okay, I think. Would someone check to make sure we're live, please?
Yeah, I can do that.
Okay. But yeah, so link is right here. For those of you here, please install VirtualBox and go ahead and download an ISO for Ubuntu or a version of Ubuntu, because later on we're going to need those, because that's what we're going to be doing. Okay, so first things first for this meeting, we have some announcements. First of all, the programming competition was last week, and we're going to announce the winners. All the winners have already got their prize and everything. First place with 20 points was Brandon Wong. Second place with 19 points was Justin Maddox, and third place with 18 points was Hunter Soliday. So, round of applause for them. Yeah, okay. Also, this is kind of new. We're starting a Linux users group here in Stillwater. It's gonna be like a Stillwater, Oklahoma State Linux users group. Not really anything super formal right now. Mainly just a place for anybody who uses Linux at Oklahoma State to get together and talk about issues you might have, or like just openly discuss Linux. If you're interested in that, my email is linked there, or just come to me right after here, and I'll get you added to the group.
And for this next announcement, Hannah.
Yes.
Yes.
So we're going to be selling ACM t-shirts. They go from sizes extra small to 4XL. If you pre-order, which just like don't pre-order, just let me know. Shoot me a group me, or tell me now. And if you order before October 20th, they are $15. But if it's like extra large, or extra large, some of those, like, it goes up $1 for each X. And then if you want to buy one after October 20th, they're going to be $18, but supplies are limited because we don't know how many people want to buy one after that. So yeah, and that's a picture of them.
And as your point of contact for that, her email is in the notes. Just click that wonderful link. Yeah, last year I know we had a lot of people buying our shirts with Andrew's wearing. It's a good way to be a good computer science community. Always fun to have some fun programming joke t-shirts.
And it also helps us out. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Hello.
Okay, so yeah, that's okay. One more announcement.
Immediately following this meeting, we're supposed to have the Women in Computing Club. Kayla's not here right now, which is kind of surprising, but Hannah's here.
Yeah.
And Hannah might be able to talk about this.
Yeah. So, yeah. Women in Computing meeting right after this, 6:30 to 7:30. We're going to have Dr. Mills come and speak about what it's like to work in a male-dominated field, with some tricks and things you need to know. And snacks are provided, so you should all girls should come. It's really fun.
Okay, so yeah, that's it for the announcements tonight, unless you have anything else.
No, just next week we're having a game night because it's fall break, so that'll just be a fun way to chill, relax. The week after that, we're having Raytheon come to speak. They're giving a tech talk about the latest advancements in defense technology and what software engineering even means in the world of defense. We're really excited about that. From what we've seen, it's going to be a very interesting presentation, very exciting. And so we hope you guys will make it. We're really looking forward to it, and we want to show Raytheon a big turnout.
Okay, so yeah, I guess we'll start on the actual meeting. So the topic for this meeting is Linux. So how many of you have heard of Linux before? Let's start with that. Pretty much everyone, right? But you know, what really is Linux? So when people are talking about Linux, they're normally referring to like a class of operating systems that use the Linux kernel, and most of the time they'll use some utilities from something called GNU, and they'll also have other types of software in there normally as well. So, okay, what's like a kernel and what's GNU? What is all that stuff? So I think the best way to kind of learn about that is I have linked to like the Wikipedia page about the history of Linux. If you're looking for something to do, you just want to read that, you can. But basically, the rundown is: how many of you have heard of Unix? Okay, pretty much everyone again. So Unix was something used as an operating system used on a lot of like mainframe computers and stuff. It still is. But it was actually used in the MIT Artificial Intelligence Laboratory, and this guy named Richard Stallman worked there, but he wanted a free version of Unix. So what he went out to do is make a free version of Unix It was going to be basically just like Unix, except everything was going to be like open source and free. And that is GNU, which stands for GNU's Not Unix. So it's like a recursive acronym. But he was making good progress, but he did reach like an obstacle when it came to making the kernel for GNU, which was called GNU Herd. It never really came along. So this guy Linus Torvalds in like the early 90s, he actually made a kernel called Linux, the Linux kernel, and people started realizing like, hey, this Linux kernel works really well with all these things which are Stallman made for GNU, and they put them together, and now we call that Linux. So again, if you want to learn more about some of the more details, that Wikipedia page is listed there, and there's like videos and stuff. So what about you guys using Linux, right? What are you going to be using it for? Well, really, there's probably, in general, two things you're going to want to do with a Linux system. You're either going to want to run it on a server to run like some kind of server software, to be like the back end of some kind of web application, or just to run like things that take a lot of resources that you want to have running in the background somewhere. Or you want to actually install it onto your computer and use it for everything like you would use Windows for on a daily basis. So as CS students, you're probably going to hear from time to time that it's valuable for you to have like Linux skills, right? But what does that really mean? When companies say that or people say that, they're normally talking about like they need you to be able to like log onto a server, like SSH onto a server, be able to move stuff around, start things, and basically be able to work your way around a server. Most servers run on some kind of distribution of Linux, which is why you should know what to do with that. So it is essential for you to have those skills, especially if you're pretty much no matter what field you're going into in software development. But how do you gain those skills? So that's this next section here. First way to gain those skills is to get a server, install Linux on it, and use it for something useful. One thing you can do is host a website, make an API. There's all kinds of things you can do. You could make your own cloud for your own file storage. That's really fun. You doing that, that might be actually the best way to gain the skills that employers are talking about and employers want. And it will teach you a lot about how, like if you're hosting a website or API, it'll teach you a lot about like how the web works, because that you're creating servers. And actually, this is really, really important. This is like the one thing you should get out tonight. Free stuff. As a student, you can actually get a server on DigitalOcean. Has anybody heard of DigitalOcean? Okay, so yeah, it's actually a place. It's like a website for hosting, and like you can get a server on there, and you basically pay like monthly. So this is like what actual companies would be like using DigitalOcean to get servers to run their websites and stuff. As a student, though, I mean, you've probably heard of the GitHub Student Developer Pack. You can actually get $50 credit through there, like just with your edu email address. And then, so DigitalOcean has different servers, but the lowest tier one is $5 a month. So that means you can get 10 months for free of like hosting a website, which is like, you should definitely take advantage of that. There's like no reason not to. But yeah, that's the first way to gain those skills, is to actually get a server and do all that stuff. Another way, which is just as useful, and I think is a really good way, and I think is probably the best way, is to actually use it as a primary operating system on your computer. So like replace Windows with it, or boot it alongside Windows, or Mac or whatever. So this not only gives you the command line skills that you need to know, which is what you would need to know for the server stuff, but it also can, by having it on your computer and using it every day, you start to really get an idea of how that operating system works, and all the details, all the nitty-gritty details of what makes your computer work. And there's also countless other benefits, which we're going to go into next. So here's why you should use a distribution of Linux as your primary operating system. So first of all, you can gain the skills we mentioned above. Another thing, you'll become part of a really awesome community. There's a lot of really cool like Linux subreddits, IRC channels, all that type of stuff. You can contribute code. It's completely 100% open source, and most distributions contain mostly open source software as well. So it doesn't even have to be like the Linux kernel or whatever. Like if you just find an application that's made for whatever distribution you're using, you like it, you find a bug in it, or something, you can contribute to that too. Another thing that's really a benefit of using distribution of Linux is our package repositories. We're actually going to be kind of talking more about that later, so I'm going to skip it for now. Customizability is another thing. So this is a big note. I know a lot of people, they install Linux for the first time and they don't like something about it. They're like, I just don't like the UI. I don't like the way these icons look. I don't like, the way the windows look, and it turns them off completely, right? But with Linux, if you don't like the way something is, for example, the UI, you can change it without affecting your system, right? You're not stuck with what you have, unlike with other things, and you can always revert back too. And then the best benefit is that it's free. Like with Windows, even though it comes on your computer, you still have a license stuff that's just on your computer. So if you were to install Windows on a desktop, you'd have to pay a license fee. You don't have to do that with Linux; it's completely free. So, yeah. Okay, so I've said the word distribution a few times, but what exactly is that, right? So if you consider, like I said earlier, Linux is like a class of a bunch of operating systems. The operating systems themselves are the Linux distributions. So what's the difference between, you have distros like Ubuntu or you have Arch? What's really the difference between them? Well, most of them are actually really, really similar. The differences are, the main difference for the most part is the package manager that they use, which again we're going to talk about in a second, but it's basically what installs all your applications for you. And there's also other software that they use, like system level software, or sometimes distributions will come with default desktop environments and stuff like that, or the init system is different, or but it's just the different software that they use. But most of them, I guess to be considered a Linux operating system, and they all use the Linux kernel, or at least something similar. Okay, so this next section is, I've kind of alluded to it a few times, but it's about packages. So this is one of the biggest advantages of using Linux is the way you install pieces of software, like your applications. They're called packages. So each package you might want to install is going to live on a server somewhere, and your package manager is going to download it from that server and install it. So that means you don't have to go scouring around the web. So okay, right now with Windows or whatever, if you want to install, and I think they're kind of changing this with because they have that whole app store or whatever, I don't know, but if you want to install something, you'd go to the internet, you'd find the .exe, you'd download it, you'd double click it or whatever, and it would install. The problem with that is sometimes over the internet things can become corrupted, or you don't know that your software is secure, that you're installing, and you also, it's just kind of a long process. You have to go, I guess it doesn't seem that long when you do it for a long time, but you're having to open it up, you're having to find it, and do all that. Whereas with Linux, it's literally just one command. So, yeah, and then all the packages are checked for integrity and all that stuff. I want to touch on a little bit source-based versus binary-based packages. So, some distributions, well, most distributions use binary-based packages. What that is you have the source code for your application, it's pre-compiled, and the only thing that your package manager is doing is getting that compiled version, the actual binaries, and putting them into somewhere in your path, which is the directories that you can run applications from. So it's just getting those and moving them into there. Some distributions, though, for example, Gentoo is probably the biggest one. They actually get the source code and compile it on your machine. Now, the advantage to this is that it can be optimized for your system. Most people, I mean, this is good if you're doing embedded systems and stuff like that. For your desktops, compiling things takes a really long time, and if every time you want to install something, you have to compile everything, the benefits you get by optimizing how the application runs, most of the time doesn't outweigh the cons of you having to wait forever to install something. But that's up to you. I just kind of want to touch on that a little bit. So what I'm going to do now is actually install a package on here. So this is Ben's laptop, by the way. It's on a VM in VirtualBox. This is Ubuntu, and the package manager for Ubuntu is apt, or it's sort of like all Debian-based distribution. So we're just gonna like get a piece of software. We're just gonna get like Firefox. Okay. So if you were on Windows or whatever, you'd have to go to the browser. You'd have to look for Firefox and all, do all that stuff. Literally, sudo apt install Firefox.
A super secure password.
Yes.
Right there. Password? Maybe.
I don't know. And what it's going to do is, okay, it's hard to see, but it's going to ask if you want to continue. And it's just going to go get the binary and install it. So, oh, maybe this won't take forever.
Yes.
This is why you don't use VMs.
Yeah.
We
Well-
tried. OBS was being a pain on an actual Linux machine, so we're using a VM.
Why didn't you use VNC to get into another version? Why didn't you use VNC to go to an actual Linux box, but run that VNC through a Windows machine, but OBS is actually recording the VNC session? So you have benefits of both worlds.
Would have
It's
worked.
downloading that.
Okay. So,
All right.
6%. Oh, it's going faster. It's going faster.
No,
Well, it's
no, it's you run it for, like you can run a VNC session to something outside of it.
Mm.
Or I know at least you can do it with Fedora.
To be-
probably gonna
To be fair, Ben said it was because it was on an actual Linux machine. It works on Linux. It works on Linux. It was I think it's my graphics card on my laptop is the reason that the screen capture wouldn't work.
We had a wonderful picture of a black screen with a black cursor.
Yeah, so that's
How do you know the cursor was there?
it showed it.
And it's
Oh well,
like
it was
outline.
there was an outline. Like
Okay.
okay, yeah. Okay, so while that's going, we'll show you that in a second. But I mean, really, once that finishes downloading it and installing it, everything is done there. There's nothing else you have to do. Also, it's not really mentioned in here, but most of the time with most distributions, if they're not in the actual repositories, you can have I use Arch, and with Arch there's something called the AUR, and that's where it has the community packages that the community puts up there. They're not official packages, and I don't actually know how it works with Ubuntu. I think it's something similar. It's called a PPA, but yeah, or you can get actually a .deb file, which is the same. It's kind of the equivalent of if you're on Windows and you get a .exe to install, you just get a .deb file from there, and that would work too. But the best way and the easiest way is to use the package manager. A lot of distributions, most distributions made for the regular user they actually have a graphical package manager too, so you don't have to memorize the commands. I still, since you're CS students, I recommend just getting comfortable with the terminal. It's actually, I think it's a lot faster, and you're gonna want to know how to use it anyway because you're gonna be using it. So you might as well do that. But there still is that graphical package manager there if you want to use it. I think here it's maybe on here somewhere. Maybe not. Yeah, there's software. Well, you can't see that. But yeah. Okay, so I'm gonna move on a little. Well, I think it's
Nice.
getting close. Yeah.
Getting close.
This is
Progress,
running slow
6%.
because it's on a VM. It's not gonna run.
Well, also, Firefox presumably is a pretty big program, relatively speaking.
It normally installs faster than that.
You said it was 40 megs.
Okay.
That's what it said whenever you download it.
Okay.
Okay.
The world was full of
This is machine error rather than Linux error.
Right. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you a little bit. I'm not really going to go into all this because I want to get started on the actual getting you guys installing Ubuntu in a VM. But I'm going to talk a few different common distribution choices. The first of these is Ubuntu, which I've talked about a few times. That's actually what we have on here is a version of Ubuntu called Ubuntu Budgie that we have on this VM. Ubuntu is the most popular choice, especially for beginners or just average users. If you've never used Linux before, most of the time you ask what should you use, and people just say Ubuntu. It comes with something called Unity as the default desktop environment. We're going to talk about what a desktop environment is here in a minute. But Unity is actually not going to be supported soon, and because of that, I actually recommend picking an Ubuntu, what's called Ubuntu Flavor, which is just Ubuntu but with a different desktop environment, and they're linked there, so you can do that. Also, for servers, if you have a server, Ubuntu Server is actually one of the most common distributions installed on web servers, and for a good reason. It's really stable, especially if you like the long-term support version, like it says, if it's a version with LTS, that means you're gonna have a lot of support for it. You're not, and it's gonna be really stable. It's very likely that nothing's gonna break. Like all the bugs have been found for the most part at that point. And for servers, that's what you want. There are other options for servers. I don't have them listed. I think something a lot of people use, like Fedora and Red Hat, are used for servers a lot too. Another one I wanted to mention. This was actually my first distribution that I started using a long time ago. Was Linux Mint. It's another great option for beginners. It's kind of similar to Ubuntu. Elementtree Os. This is also based on Debian, which is like Ubuntu and Linux Mint are. Elementtree Os is designed to look really, really good, which is like made to look like Mac OS basically. So that's yeah. It has like the dock at the bottom and stuff. It's mainly just a desktop environment, but it's also another easy distribution to use. And then there's Debian. So Debian is actually what Ubuntu, Linux Mint, Elementtree OS, and several other distributions. There's all kinds of distributions that are actually based on Debian. So if you like those distributions, but you want to go a little more hardcore, I guess, you go to Debian. Solus is another one. It's kind of relatively new, but it's designed with the average user in mind. So like people who aren't Linux wizards, it's works for that. And then there's some more advanced ones like Arch Linux, Engine 2. I mean, I don't recommend those for you if you're like just a beginner, you've never used Linux before, because you have to actually manually install both of them. But they're really great for learning, and if you just want something that's really customizable, they're great for that too. So later on in your Linux careers, you might want to try that. And I think that finished installing. Yeah. So all we had to do was run that one command, and normally that wouldn't take quite as long. We're just in a VM. And then we would just, in your menu of your desktop application or your desktop environment, or whatever, it would be there. There's Firefox, and we can open it up. I'm not going to because this is running slow already. But yeah, so that's how you would install a package. It's really easy. So another real quick on desktop environments. So a desktop environment is defined as a collection of programs that run on top of your OS. That consists of everything that makes up the UI. So it's going to be all your icons over here that aren't showing, the windows, and all your like toolbars and different widgets and stuff that are built into your desktop environment. That's all part of your desktop environment. So here's another thing I see a lot, because I have a lot of friends that I recommend you should use Ubuntu, or you should use Ubuntu 2, or you should use some other distribution of Linux. And if they've never used Linux before, they download like Ubuntu, they see Unity, which is that default desktop environment, or they do Linux Mint, and they see Cinnamon, which is that default desktop environment, and they get the wrong impression because they don't like using that environment. They're not used to it. They don't like the way something is, and they just don't like the whole ecosystem of they don't like the whole workflow of how it's forcing you to do that, and that makes them think I don't like Linux. There's some desktop environments that actually have do not look modern at all. They look really, really old, and that gives people the impression a lot of times that Linux is old, right? Which isn't really true, because you can change that. So this is another really good thing I want you to get out of this, is that if you install Linux, in the near future, and you don't like the way something is, if you don't like the desktop environment, you can find different ones and install them, and it's not hard at all. It's not going to affect your system. Actually, Ethan, if you don't mind me saying anything, the other day Ethan was like, "Hey, I don't like Unity," so he installed Gnome. And how easy was it?
Well, the thing is, you did it.
I didn't do it.
It was pretty easy.
Okay.
But it only took you 5 minutes. Besides loading.
And you could, if you didn't like it, you could go right back to Unity.
Yeah.
Right. So.
It was command line.
Yeah. So I'm gonna list some good options here. This is by no means a comprehensive list. This is just some things that I've used and that I like. There's all kinds of them though. You can just probably look up like lists of Linux desktop environments or something. First one's Gnome. This one's Gnome and KDE are probably like two most popular. Like, they've been like neck and neck for a really long time. Gnome's really popular. It's really customizable. There's like a lot of extensions you can install, and you can look at that on your own if you want.
Gnome's really cool.
Yeah,
I like it.
Ethan, that's what he's talking about. KDE is another one that's common, and it's really popular. It's actually probably a little more configurable than Gnome. They're also making, I didn't know this until recently, but KDE is also making like a mobile version, which it doesn't run very well because one of the phones that they're developing for currently is a phone that I have, like a previous one that I had that I haven't sold it or anything yet. So I installed it on there, but yeah, it's really slow. But yeah, so that's a cool thing about KDE. XFCE is something that's really lightweight. I've used this all the time, especially if you have older hardware, or maybe you're on a Chromebook that you're doing this, through Crouton, and you don't have enough resources to run GNOME or KDE or Unity or something. XFCE is a really good choice, which I think is what you're using, right? Yeah, it's a great choice for that, and it's also extremely configurable. You can configure everything on it. Budgie, that's actually what we're using on this one. This is probably my new favorite desktop environment, but that's just my personal opinion. It was made for the Solus operating system, which I mentioned earlier. It's like GNOME in a lot of ways, but it also has some differences and some things built in. I really like that one. Another one is Mate. This is another pretty lightweight choice, kind of like XFCE. It's actually a continuation of an older version of GNOME. So they had GNOME 2, and then they came out with GNOME 3. A lot of people didn't like GNOME 3 because it was new. So like everything was different than what they were used to, which is fine, right? Like you're used to something, but since it's open source, people were able to fork it, and they made Mate, which is just basically GNOME 2, but with continued support. So yeah, those are some you can choose. Next thing, real quick, these are some things, like some tips and things I wish I knew. I mean, I've been using Linux for a while, actually, just because I was kind of forced into it, mainly because like my first computer that I ever got just had Linux on it already. And these are some things that like there's a big learning curve. Obviously, like if you've never used Linux before and you're just used to doing things, it's gonna be hard to get used to at first. But here's some things that like I wish I knew when I started, and like some other tips that I give you. First of all, YouTube videos are great. I recommend if you having trouble with something, watch a YouTube video, like a tutorial about it, but they do become outdated quickly, and especially depending on, what you're using. So one example, it's like I use Arch Linux, and the process of installing Arch Linux is a really long process, but it's really fun, don't get me wrong. But when I first started doing it, I'd watch a bunch of YouTube videos, and they would all be like completely different. So like the best thing to do is to read the current documentation. That's because you can update a bunch of lines of text a lot faster than you can update a video. So that's always the best place to look, is the actual documentation. Another thing that I actually didn't start doing until recently, because I always thought like, I can look it up on the internet. Man pages. These are really, really good, right? So I spelled really wrong. I don't know. So if you have like a command, like let's say, apt, right? Apt is the package manager for Ubuntu, and like I don't know how to use it. I don't even know what apt is. So what you could do is you could go to your web browser and search it, and that's what I would have been doing until recently. But these are actually built into your system. You don't have to be connected to the internet to do it. So you can do man and apt, and this is really large. I'm gonna. Yeah, and then you can, just scroll through there. And it tells you everything about it, the descriptions, and tells you commands that you can use too, which is what it's doing right now. And you hit Q to quit. And you could look up like a tutorial on like how to effectively use man pages and stuff like that. But those man pages are actually really useful. Like I recommend using them. Okay, another thing, get involved in some Linux communities online. There's subreddits, all kinds of subreddits for like whether it be the Linux subreddit or like the subreddit for a specific distribution of Linux that you're using, or like IRC channels, or the Oklahoma State Linux Teachers Group. Shameless plug. But yeah, so get involved in those. And then I also have some resources listed here. Use. I actually do want to point out this one, linuxjourney.com. I think there's a link there. It actually has like a bunch of like kind of lessons type things that teach you about all kinds of topics in Linux, starting from like the beginning of like how do you use the command line, all the way to like how to do like fancy networking stuff. So I recommend doing that. Man page is already mentioned. Also books. I had a book that I was gonna bring, but I just realized I completely forgot it. But there's really good books if you're interested in like learning like actually what's going on like at the system level and stuff with and like how Linux works all throughout the entire stack. Like there's a lot of good books about that. Or if you just want a book on like how to use Linux, you can do that too. So what should you do now? By now I mean like after the meeting at some point if you want to learn more. Go through as much as you can on that Linux Journey site that actually teaches you quite a bit of stuff. If you're feeling like you might like Linux, hopefully you do now, install a distro onto your computer. You don't have to replace, if you have like Windows or Mac or whatever on there, you don't have to replace it. You can actually do a dual boot, and if you're having trouble with that, you can ask me for help, or you can probably find a lot of help online for it. But you can dual boot to where you can choose which one to boot into at startup. Also, if you're not quite so sure, you don't want to install it on your actual hard drive, you can install it in a VM, which is what we're going to do right now. So does everyone have VirtualBox installed and you have a ISO Ubuntu ready to go? Does anybody not have it ready to go? Okay. Do you need some help with it, or?
Do we have any
Yeah, for free to watch yourself.
Okay.
a flash drive or something?
Flash drive?
Yeah, I want to install it on my system. I have space.
Okay. Yeah, if you want to do that. I don't have a flash drive with me.
My flash drive in
Okay.
I do with the cellular ones.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know.
Right?
What were you gonna install? What? Ubuntu? Yeah. I mean, we're gonna be going through the process like on a VM. It's it's not a super hard process.
It's always going to be really slow. I don't have a lot of computation power.
I wish I would have brought a flash
I
drive.
would have brought.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, if you come back, I mean, we can help you with it. So. Okay.
Install this one, install this one, and install this one.
We're gonna.
Your OBS is set up to
Andrew,
do this bit.
there's 86 pages of Gnome extensions.
Yeah.
I've installed so much bloatware.
Wait, you've never.
No, I haven't.
You've never seen?
I'm new to Gnome.
Oh, okay.
I just discovered this.
Those are great. I love Gnome
I
extensions.
might blow my laptop.
I've spent like 12 hours, like just.
We're just gonna click.
Let's see if you can rival Hewlett Packard.
Right, so OBS.
Your OBS is set up. Don't worry.
Okay.
You mean this one?
Okay, so we're gonna actually go ahead and get started. I'm going to minimize the VM that we had
You
going,
can kill it if you
or
want.
kill it
You're
if
allowed
I
to kill it.
want. I'm allowed to kill it. Okay, powering off that VM that we had. Alright, I'm gonna minimize this too. Okay.
Minimize whatever you need.
Oh. That's OBS.
Minimize OBS.
I guess so.
You're at 20% battery.
Okay, so yeah, we're gonna go ahead and get started on making a virtual machine. So does everyone have VirtualBox set up, like open? You should be seeing a screen like this. You're not gonna have this right here because we already have a virtual machine on here. But, does everyone have that then? Okay. So what we're gonna do is click New, and the name I'm gonna just call this Ubuntu Budgie. Because that's what I'm going to be using. You can just name it Ubuntu. You can name it whatever you want. You can name it Fred. No, I don't care.
I'm gonna name my next VM Fred in honor of you.
And then it fills the stuff in by default when you do Ubuntu. But if you name it something like Fred, you're going to want to choose Linux and then choose Ubuntu 64-bit for the type-in version. Next, you're giving a virtual machine, like if you're not familiar with the concept, it's basically just like, you can think of it just the machine that like exists on inside your computer that's not real. So you're going to give it some memory. This is going to be RAM. We'll do 2048. That's going to be like 2 gigs instead of just 1. So we just gave it 2 gigs of RAM. You can just click create there. This is basically creating a hard disk now, a virtual hard disk. I would go ahead and choose dynamically allocated. You can choose fixed size if you want. Dynamically allocated just means you can change it later, the size. I mean, I've never had to do that, but it seems like a good thing to do. You want to give it enough space. So if you're going to want to be actually doing stuff on this, you might want to give it more space than 10 gigs. This is just for demonstration purposes, so we're just going to give it 10 gigs. And there it is. So that's going to be this is just like you have a computer now, just like you have a computer in front of you. Now, hopefully, you have an Ubuntu ISO that you downloaded, either of Ubuntu or some kind of flavor of Ubuntu, or another Linux distribution if you wanted to do that too. We just kind of wanted to keep it all consistent by choosing Ubuntu to install here. So you have this computer. So what you'd want to do now, if you have like an actual computer with you, is you're going to want to get like a USB stick or a CD-ROM, and you're going to want to get that ISO, and you're going to want to use a tool. There's like image writing tools to write that ISO image to the CD or the USB drive, and then you're going to plug it into your computer and boot from it, which we're going to simulate here. So if you click on your VM that you created and you go to settings, you can go to storage, and then right here, this little disk thing, that's just like your disk drive, and you basically think of this as just plugging in. You think of this as just plugging in that USB drive that has that the ISO has been written to.
I just want to say the reason that Budgie's already coming up in the list was because I've already created a virtual machine with that distro. But as you can see, like, if you don't have that, you could just go into your downloads or whatever and pull up that Ubuntu-Budgie or whatever ISO it is. So if nothing's coming up, that's why. It's just because you haven't made a VM with it yet.
So you're going to want to select that, and remember, that's just basically like you're plugging in your USB drive. And then once you have that in, you can actually go ahead and start. Now, on an actual computer, this might be more complicated. Some of them, you have to hit like escape or F12 or F2, depending on what computer you use when you're booting up, to allow you to like boot from a USB drive. But we can just hit start here, and it'll automatically do it. So this is actually booting up this computer, and it's going to be booting up from that ISO.
I think if you close out that top notification, it goes full screen.
Well, this part won't yet until. And yeah, the thing about most distributions, especially like Ubuntu and stuff, is they actually make installation pretty easy. I kind of want to just go through the process anyway. There's some distributions that, you know, like Arch version 2, you actually have to like do everything yourself, which is pretty fun. So if you ever want to do that, you can. But with this, it's pretty easy. And this is, again, like whenever you're installing this, remember that everything's being run from like your USB drive, not from your actual hard drive. So don't get the wrong impression like it's slow or anything. It's slow because it's running on a USB drive. Nothing's, and at that point, nothing's actually on your computer. Nothing's actually installed to your hard drive. You're just booting straight from the USB drive. And most distributions, like most Ubuntu derivatives anyway, have this thing where you can actually hit try, and that's when you just run it off of the USB drive. Again, it's not going to run very well, but you run it off there, feel around, make sure you like it before you actually go to install it. We're going to skip that step and just hit install. Does anybody having any issues or anything, by the way, at this point?
Yeah, I think I accidentally uninstalled Windows and just installed Ubuntu. What do I do?
Okay, Jacob. I don't want to hear it.
You celebrate. You no longer have windows.
Yes. You do a dance.
No longer under its glasses.
Shh.
Glasses.
They're listening. They're listening.
What?
They're listening.
Oh.
Okay. So this part, actually, when you're doing it, you probably want to go ahead and do this. Like this download updates while installing Ubuntu Budgie part. That's just so you don't have to run sudo apt update when you're done. But we don't really have that much time. We're kind of trying to get this done quickly, so I'm not going to select either of those. We're just going to go to continue. Okay, so this next part, this is actually the part that's installing it onto the disk. I don't know how well you can see this. The first option is to erase the disk and install Ubuntu Budgie completely. So that's going to erase everything you have. You're going to lose everything, and it's just going to install it with Ubuntu. Now, if you have a different operating system on your computer, most of the time this installer will actually detect it. Sometimes, anyway. And if it does, it'll give you the option like, okay, keep Microsoft Windows and install Ubuntu Budgie alongside it, or something like that. Sometimes it doesn't detect it. Like it'll detect other Linux distributions, but it won't detect Windows. So what you'd want to do is go to something else, and you go to continue, and you actually have, this is your hard drive, dev SDA, and you're going to want to create the partitions yourself. And I'll actually, once I get this started, I'm actually going to talk a little bit about what partitions are, and what all that stuff means, what partitions you need. But for now, I'm just going to go back, and we're just going to erase disk and install Ubuntu Budgie.
Again, we're in a virtual machine, so this isn't actually going to wipe your real disk. It's wiping your virtual disk.
Your computer's fine. I mean, as long as you're inside a virtual machine, you're not going to erase anything. Unless you, do something really weird, I don't know. So yeah, then just install it. Yes, and it's gonna give you a warning because again, this is changing your actual, your virtual disk in this case. But if this is on your actual computer, you're about to change your actual disk and delete everything. So make sure to back up before you do this, all your files. It's just gonna give you a warning. Hit continue. Now it's gonna start doing the generating the locale. Your locale is basically what language you use, so programs know what to do, and time zones and stuff. So we're not in Chicago, but we're in Chicago time zone, so that's fine. It's gonna ask you, I think, keyboard layout next. Yes. Most of you probably just use the English keyboard layout. If you use something else, they're all listed here. You just select it. Okay, and now is when you start creating a user. Any ideas for names?
Fred.
I already said Fred. Anybody else have a good idea for a name?
Toast.
Toast? Toast what's his last name?
Make toast or something.
Shred it.
Toasty McBread.
Okay, you already said toast, so what'd you say?
Shred it.
Shred it?
Shred it.
What?
SCHREIBIT. Shred it.
Tribe it. Okay. So his username is going to be Toasty, and his password is going to be the most secure password ever. Okay, and you can also here select whether or not you want to be logged in automatically, or you want your password to require you to log in. I mean, that's pretty self-explanatory stuff. You can also encrypt your home folder if you wanted. That's always fun. Jacob, encrypting your. You could also. I said you could also encrypt your home folder, or you could encrypt your phone.
I got it decrypted.
Okay, we'll talk about it later. So yeah, now you hit continue. You've created a user, and now it's going to start the actual installation process, which is probably where we're going to stop because it's 6:17. We may be able to finish. So I'm actually going to explain what partitions are and what partitions you need.
That's not right. Why are you looking at me?
Name's not.
My name's not on there, sir.
I thought your name.
Yeah, that was for our class. Yeah, whoops.
I erased it.
Yeah.
Find an eraser.
Have fun.
Because I would have erased it before we started, but then I was like, there's no one here, so I guess we. Yeah.
I'm just going to use the space I have available.
Smart.
So, here's your hard disk, right? Name is Fred. So like the partitions are just like separate pieces of your hard disk that you are. Partitions are like separate pieces of your hard disk that you're, installing. The different things exist on. So for most of the time with Linux, you're going to have a few different partitions. You're going to have your boot partition. You're going to have your home, or not your home. Sorry, you can.
You should.
Well, I don't, but there are benefits to doing it. You're going to have your root partition, and you're going to have sometimes what's called swap space. And I'm going to share like I should play that. So your boot partition is just used for like your bootloader to load the actual operating system on there. It's something that with Ubuntu it probably makes for you. And in other cases, for like Arch and stuff, you have to make it yourself. Your root file system, this is the main thing. This is probably going to be your biggest. Well, unless you are doing like a separate root and home. I'll talk about it in a second, but this is probably going to be your biggest. This is where it's like your actual file system. When you have like this, a slash, that's like the top of what?
It's like C drive.
Oh yeah. So it's like your C drive, right? On Windows. That's like the top of your directory. It contains a bunch of other directories. One of those is home. There's also like bin. There's also like user, bunch of other things. You can look into that yourself if you want. Bin is going to contain your actual binaries. It's one of the directories that will contain actual binaries. So like whenever you type a command into your terminal, what's actually happening, it's actually running a program, just like as if you wrote a program in like Java or whatever, and then you run it by typing Java name of the program. Okay? It's actually doing that, it's just you don't have to type like the name of whatever's running it because it's an already an executable, but it exists inside here, so it knows to look inside there. There's also user contains a bunch of like shared folders and stuff. There's also user bin, which is like the same thing as this, just with it. I don't know if there's like a convention or whatever as far as like which programs put it in where, like where your package manager puts your binary files. I know that the bin, like the root/bin, that normally contains your like regular stuff that you're gonna have on everything, like ls, cat, cd, all that type of stuff is normally contained in here. That's where those binary executables are. And then a lot of times with when you install packages, like I just installed Firefox, and I could run Firefox from the command line, well, that binary is actually going to exist in here, in the user bin. So there's also other places on your path. So like all of these things where executables are defined by your path variable. And that just has like a whole bunch of lists of these directories. But you also have home, and then like your username, and that's where you contain all your, that's where you have all of like your files, like your traditional like desktop documents, videos, all that type of stuff. That's normally contained in there. And then if you had separate users on your machine, you'd have different username subdirectories under the home. So what the partition is, again, is separate pieces of your hard drive. So you have like a small piece per boot, normally around like 512 megabytes, sometimes less. If you're using EFI, you have to have an EFI system partition, which I think is normally recommended to be 512 megabytes, like at the minimum. You can do like a gig or whatever if you want. But then your root, if you're doing like the way I normally do it, your root would just take up as much space as possible. And there's this thing called swap, okay? So you have, your computer has a certain amount of RAM, like 2 gigs, 4 gigs, 8 gigs, 16 gigs, I don't know. I will say, so what swap is, it actually is a piece of your hard drive that can be used as like memory. You can act like it's RAM. That way, if you run out of RAM, if you're using too much RAM, you can actually your system will actually use this piece on the hard drive as RAM. I will say, if you have like 2 gigs of RAM, yeah, maybe you should use some swap space. Most people don't use swap space anymore. Everyone did like 10 years ago. if you have 4 gigs of RAM, you could maybe make do with like 2 gigs of swap space. It's like you're running a lot of things, but if you have more than that, if you have like 8 gigs of RAM, you probably don't need any swap space. Unless you're running something like that's going to use a lot of RAM. Like if you have like 10 tabs of Chromium open or something. Yeah. Yeah, and then so the rest of it, so this would be like your boot, and this would be your swap, and then the rest of it, in some cases, and like the way I do it, would be your root. So this is going to contain this, your root. This is called root, like the slash, and everything underneath it. That's what this partition is going to contain. Now, some people, like Jacob was mentioning earlier, some people like to separate out their root and home, so like have a separate partition. So in some cases, you'd have about like 20 gigs or so, or sometimes less, of your root, and then the rest of it be for all your actual files. So that would be your home directory. So this would be your home partition. So everything that's in root/home is going to be in this partition. And that's really what that was doing. It did all that automatically for you. And most of the time, people want to do it the same way. If you're installing something like Arch or something, you'd have to do this yourself. And you can do it yourself on there too. Which brings to the point about dual boot. You basically have your hard drive, and you have a certain amount of it for all your Windows stuff, and then you just split it up and you create a bunch of separate partitions for your Linux stuff. So like all of this would be Windows, right? And then you would have the rest of your stuff. So that's what dual booting is. And then you'd still have just one boot partition for your bootloader, and that would be what allowed you to select Windows or Ubuntu or whatever.
You're in the right place. Don't worry.
Okay. But yeah, so that's like what that was doing. That's what partitions are. That kind of explains your file structure a little bit. And I think that installation is complete. So.
Yeah, let me go back to show
yes.
screen. There you go. Done.
Yeah. And restart now is what you're going to want to select, and that's restarting your computer. So, which is restarting the VM in this case. It's also going to ask you to like remove your installation media. Like in real life, that would be like.
ISO, right? ISO needs to be removed, right?
Yeah, it doesn't necessarily have to be. Like you just when you select what to boot, you boot off of the actual hard drive rather than booting off the flash drive. So when this says please remove installation medium, that means you take out the flash drive. I mean, we can't really do that in this case because it's a VM, so we'll just press enter, act like we did it.
I know for the original, for like normal Ubuntu, actually VirtualBox it'll eject and like unmount that ISO automatically.
Oh really? Okay.
It is so cool.
Yeah.
It's sentient. It knows what to do.
Yeah, so now you just restart your computer, you boot from the actual hard drive instead of your flash drive, or CD or whatever, and it's going to actually have a Ubuntu Budgie installed. Which, I mean, it's stuff you've seen before now at this point. So,
yep.
Was anybody able to get it all the way installed? Awesome, yeah. So now, what you should do is, first of all, come to me, get added to that group of the Linux users group so you can get help if you need it, and install Linux on your own computers instead of a VM, because you already know that you like it because you're using a VM. So now you can put it on your own computers. And if you need any help, you can reach out to me on GroupMe. I'll add you to that group, or if you're part of the OSU ACM GroupMe, you can, find me on there too.
You can also reach out to me. Apparently, I'm also a Linux expert, which isn't true, but I know enough about Linux to get you in the right way.
I'm not a Linux expert.
Basically, he knows enough about Linux to point you to Andrew when he gets frustrated.
I'm not an expert by any means, but.
Hey, Ed, we need to wrap up pretty quickly, but before we go, do we have any questions for Andrew about Linux? Anything Linux?
How hard is it to get Grub working on Arch?
Oh, not at all. No, not at all. Like, you literally you install Grub, you do Grub install. Okay, do you have an EFI or like probably?
This is running virtual.
Oh, okay. In that case, you don't. You're probably not using UEFI. So literally, you just have to do. I think. If you look at the Arch wiki,
Grub install through some really weird errors.
Okay. What did you just run Grub install, or did you tell it what to install it on? I'll help you. This is getting kind of
Where would you go after Unity or not Unity, Ubuntu?
after
You
Ubuntu.
wanted to go like
Deeper.
Want to go deeper? You're probably honestly already experienced enough. Like you don't have to have that much experience to move on to something like Arch or Gen 2, just play around with. I mean, yeah, you can use
If you want to be
Debian.
familiar with the Ubuntu architecture, you could just go to Debian, which is like it's Ubuntu with a layer peeled off, basically.
It uses the same package manager, even though I will say, Pacman is the best package manager. Okay. So
Anything else? Cool. Well, thank you guys for coming. Andrew, good job. Thank you. Just a few reminders again. If you want shirts, talk to Hannah. Also, next week we're doing a game night because it's fall break. We're lazy. We don't want to do hard stuff, so we're doing a game night. But the week after that, Raytheon is coming to talk about tech in defense and software engineering in defense, and we're really excited about that. We want to show them a big turnout, so you guys should be there.
Friends.
Yeah, absolutely. Women in computing, like immediately following this. So I think if you want to stick around, you're free to stick around for that. And do we have anything else we needed to announce? I think we did a good enough job.
No.
Yeah, cool. Thank you guys for coming.
live stream.
Yes, absolutely. We're trying.
Does anybody want to be added to the Linux users group? Okay.
Yes. Okay, let's.
No, I need more.
Actually, she doesn't even have a page for that.
All right, here you go.
Yeah, are you? Yes.
Oh.